Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Assess, Test or Terminate, What Future for Climate Engineering Research. This is our chance to think about the future. We've spent a lot of time talking about what is, a lot of time talking about what should be. This is the chance to talk about what will be. Before the fun begins, I want to give a vote of thanks. I don't know if it's just because I normally go to shambolic conferences, but the organisation here at the Scandic has seemed to me to be exemplary. So I don't wonder if you join me, put your hands together and thank all the staff and the volunteers who made this run so smoothly. So it was the baseball player Yogi Berra who I think said it best when he said it's tough to make predictions, especially when it's about the future, and how right he was. David Keith and I last year were asked by Scientific American magazine to write 3 scenarios for the world at 2100 where solar geoengineering had been deployed. And before I did this panel, I went back and I looked to see what we predicted. Amongst other things, we came up with genetically modified trees destroying agriculture in high latitudes, the desertification of the Amazon, and total global war between armies of robots. So we got here today to see whether the panel agrees with that. So that's the most likely geoengineered future, or whether they think there's something truly outlandish out there. We're going to take brief introductory comments from each of the panelists. We're then going to open things up to questions. I'll remind you what I reminded the panelists. I'm going to push you as far as possible to make predictions about scenarios. We've spent so much time talking about what should be. It's time to hear what is going to happen. So reading the tea leaves for you first, we're going to have Victoria Wibeck. Victoria is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Science at Linköping University in Sweden. And Victoria, I'd ask you to throw away your inhibitions, ignore the cameras, and predict like there was no tomorrow. Or in fact, predict like there was a tomorrow, but you knew what was going to happen.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. Well, I will give you my thoughts on the future of climate engineering research as a social scientist, particularly interested in public perceptions and the formation of social representations. And I will also have the perspective from Sweden, which is a country where there has been very little public debate on climate engineering so far. And I want to take my starting point in some studies that I and my colleagues at Linköping University are conducting. We are, among other things, we're studying the public debate on climate engineering in the media. We are studying public perceptions, governance issues, and also what the scientific literature looks like on climate engineering. And I want to start with outlining a few trends which my colleague Björn-Ola Linnér and I found when we reviewed the peer-reviewed literature on climate engineering, both social science and natural science literature. And we analyzed the papers listed in Scopus and Web of Science databases from 2006 up until the end of 2013. And I will just pick out some things that we saw that perhaps could be a signal of what we could expect, I'm not sure. First of all, as probably comes as no surprise, and other studies have also shown that there has been a very rapid increase of research into the field of climate engineering, whatever that field is, but anyway. Not only in the number of papers being published, but also in the number of authors engaging in this, and in the number of different technologies being discussed. And one thing that we found was that social science research has been expanding very rapidly. And actually, well, it started kind of in parallel, natural science and social science research. And last year, actually, the number of social science papers outnumbered the amount of natural science papers published in any previous years. And I would predict that perhaps this is something we could expect also for the next few years, because when we are discussing at conferences like this what kind of challenges and issues that are before us, they are very much of a social character. And therefore, I would guess that social science research would continue to increase and expand. I think that many of the papers on social science climate engineering research have been dealing with governance issues. I think we'll see more of that as it becomes more and more clear that this is very complex. I think we will also have more research into methodologies for analyzing what the public thinks. And the more we start to study this, the more we get aware that it's really tricky to do that kind of research. And I think we could learn from the studies that have been made so far, and I would predict that for the future, it will be very much discussion about methodologies and how we can actually frame these kind of studies. We also saw in our analysis that there is an increasing diversity in this field. I'm a bit hesitant to call this a field, by the way, because it's very divergent and it's kind of hard to define what's included. But if you use the ordinary search words, it's kind of comes out a pattern that in the natural science literature, there is an increasing diversity of technologies being discussed. And we found that the last 2 years, the share of papers dealing with SAI decreased, while other technologies popped up. I'm not sure if this is a trend that will continue, but perhaps that's something we could discuss. For the social science literature, very many still talk about climate engineering as a general concept. But I think that this will change. I think that the social science studies will go more and more into discussing the specifics of different technologies and of different types of technologies. So that would be another one of my predictions. We also have seen that this is it's a very complex field, of course, and there is a lot of ambivalence in the research literature about how to position oneself. And also there is a lot of warnings and cautions and not so very clear recommendations about how to proceed. And this complexity and diversity is also reflected in the public debate. And when we conducted some focus group studies in Sweden, my colleague Anders Hansson, who is here somewhere, and myself, we found some issues related to the construction and formation of public perceptions that I would like to bring out here. What we did, this was not a public engagement study, by the way. It was more exploring the formation of social representations at an early stage. And we decided to provide the participants in our study with rather little information about climate engineering. Because we know that in the Swedish case, as in many other countries, climate engineering is largely unknown to the public. And this was reflected also in our focus group. The people coming there had no idea what this was about. And that, of course, poses specific challenges for us as social science researchers, because that means that whatever we say to them, we will participate in framing climate engineering to the public. And that is a specific type of challenge, which I think we will have to deal with even more in the future. That is something that's already being discussed a lot in the social science community, but I think we'll have to discuss that in greater depth. We also found that in our groups, although people didn't know very much about climate engineering, they were very well capable of discussing the ethical issues, governance issues, different very relevant aspects like trustworthiness in social institutions and things like that. And this is similar to what we've seen when we have studied other emerging technologies, like GMOs, for instance, that people can actually have very well reflected discussions, even if they are not technical experts. At least this is what we found in our Swedish studies. And I think there is something important here, that many of the studies being carried out today are from Europe and the US. And we've been discussing this over and over again in this conference, that we have perhaps had a narrow focus in our research. And I would, again, predict that for the future, the scope of public perceptions and public engagement studies will probably broaden, because many of us are aware that this is really could be a problem for social science research. And also, I think that we will see more discussions about when we engage the public and when we try to take public perceptions into account here, who are actually participating in our studies. And all of us who have worked with focus groups probably know that it's very hard to get people to participate. And there, of course, we have to be very cautious not just to involve those who have strong opinions, strong voices, come from privileged groups. So how we will include like gender issues, equity issues, taking into account the perspective of minority groups, will become even more crucial, I think, as we move into the future. And I would predict that these types of discussions, we have not seen the end of them. We have seen the beginning, and I think we will continue from there. Thanks.
Good stuff. Thank you. Next up, I'm going to pick on Hauke. Hauke Schmidt is an atmospheric scientist at the Planck Institute for Meteorology in Hamburg. Hauke.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you in particular for stealing my initial joke. So I didn't want to talk about baseball, but about football. So at my institute, I'm known as a person loving to play football, watch football, talk about football. And at the occasion of the last betting game for the World Cup, I ended up last of 30+ department members. So now I'm going to predict for you the future of geoengineering research. So I will concentrate on radiation management, and I will also concentrate only on the natural sciences. And as a climate modeler, we usually, at least so far, have refrained from talking about predictions, but we try to talk about projections. And I will use this concept a bit here. I think the future of geoengineering research, in particular in the next decade, will depend a bit on the state of climate itself and of the perception of climate. So if the hiatus is going on still for a while, I think climate engineering research may still be considered as some intellectual exercise, interesting but not of much necessity and relevance. However, if we go back to temperature increase rates like in the last decades of the 20th century, or if there may be something that is perceived as a climate emergency, whatever that is, and it may not be real, but mainly only perceived as a climate emergency, then I think the geoengineering research debate will intensify a lot. And let's think about this second case that people will ask us. I mean, let's try seriously to think about implementing climate engineering. And as a climate modeler, I think we know all that models are imperfect tools, but still necessary tools to understand, and probably the only tools to have projections for the future climate, certainly necessary tools. So I think the modeling will go on and intensify. What is clear from this conference, I think, is that GeoMap, the model intercomparison projects for solar radiation management, have been and are still useful studies that will extend to carbon dioxide removal methods, I think. That is fairly clear. Sorry? I think that is fairly clearly coming out from this conference. I would also like to come back to something Ken Calera said in the initial panel. I'm also not citing, but trying to paraphrase. He said something like, we may think we know more than we actually know. And I think that is a danger of climate modeling, that we produce these nice figures, which are based on many assumptions, for example, on the assumptions that these methods are working, and maybe give a false impression. We show these 7.5% reduction of precipitation in northern India or so. But we have to explain to the public that these predictions are fairly uncertain and that the models have errors. So in the case that this discussion becomes more serious, I think there will be a push for better models. And I think there is room for model improvements. We don't know if they will ever become as good to really predict with enough certainty the outcome of climate engineering. But there will be a push for better models. Another emerging field that I see, I mean, we also have to be aware of, as climate modelers, that what we are simulating, like, for example, some precipitation change in some region or temperature change, it's not really about impacts. So we sometimes think, well, reduction of precipitation may be bad, but the impacts on ecosystems and population are not totally clear alone from these numbers coming from global climate models. So I think there will be an intensification of impact studies. So far for climate modeling, which is really my field, but of course the debate also in the recent days has been a lot on field experiments that may or may not be performed in the near future. And also something that, again, Ken Caldera said in the initial panel, we have to be careful when we say we. Who are we meaning when we say we? And now I will say I. So I'm pretty sure that I will not initiate a field experiment in the next decade. However, that is not because I'm a priori sure that field experiments are useless. By no means. I think field experiments could be useful. For example, if we remember the ocean iron fertilization debate and remember the ocean iron fertilization experiments, I think these experiments have proven very useful. In particular, they have shown us that things are more complicated than they had been maybe portrayed by some people arguing in favor of this method before. So that could be a very useful outcome of other field experiments too. Also, I think we know not enough about aerosol cloud interactions, which are at the heart of some of the methods that are proposed. We don't know enough about aerosol microphysics in general, also in stratospheric aerosol microphysics. So I wouldn't per se ban experiments that could provide better insight in these in these issues. And I think we will see small-scale field experiments in the near future. I'm not at all sure that they will have important new insight. I simply don't know enough about the proposed experiments to be able to judge in which sense they may be useful. I think we will see experiments. I hope that they will be performed at least in the spirit of the Oxford principles. In the case of a perceived climate emergency, I'm not sure that this will actually be the case. I think that in that case there will be experiments of all kind of nature. Maybe one last comment. I mean, Jim Fleming was speaking at some earlier panel, and I think I enjoyed very much reading his book, Fixing the Sky, which was mainly about weather modification and then not climate modification or climate engineering. But I think there one can learn a lot from history, in particular, for example, that many of the suggestions have failed. But I think we should think more about weather modification. And one scenario that I see for the future for climate engineering is that small-scale weather modification may turn to larger and larger scales, in particular of a climate emergency, where the transfer from weather modification, which is taking place or attempted in many places, to climate modification may happen gradually. That's my initial statement. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Hauke. So next up we have a change to your program. The role of Will Burns today will be played by his colleague Simon Nicholson. Simon is the director of the Global Environmental Politics Program at American University in Washington, D.C. Simon.
Thanks, Andy. So I was on a panel this morning where two different nightmare scenarios were advanced. One by Clive Hamilton, the other by Andy. Clive's nightmare was being locked in a penthouse apartment with Rupert Murdoch, which you may think is nightmare enough, but the nightmare continues. He was watching Rupert Murdoch send out a tweet which said something like, climate change is a real thing, the way to respond is through climate engineering. Andy's nightmare scenario was a little different. He imagined some sort of disastrous weather event taking place that affected people in the United States at some point in the next decade. And a group of political analysts and pundits gathered on a television news show being asked the question, what can we do? And somebody on the right, from the American political right, puts forward the idea that climate engineering is the only possible way to respond in the short term in ways that might alleviate or help prevent future weather emergencies. And Andy postulated the interviewer turning to the scientist also on the panel. The scientist being asked the question, is this the best way to respond? Is it the only way to respond in the short term? And the scientist being forced to say, well yes, it is. These are nightmare scenarios, I think, because if the political right in the United States and perhaps in other places gets a hold of climate engineering as the solution, as the proper response to climate change, we get into a situation where we don't see the sort of rational, careful, considered research and potential deployment of climate engineering that we hear about at these sorts of conferences. We see a rush to climate engineering. Or we see climate engineering used as a way to delay other forms of response to the climate crisis. No, I work with a group in Washington, D.C. that we call the Washington Geoengineering Consortium. And part of the work of the consortium is political engagement. We engage a great deal with the D.C. policy establishment. We take lots of meetings with different people around Washington, D.C. And I should be careful and clear about my next couple of comments. I'm not speaking for the US government here. My accent alone should dissuade you of the idea that I'm speaking for the US government. What I do want to say is that the US government at the moment has little formal interest in geoengineering research. There are a handful of people in different government agencies in the United States who are doing different types of research that may be construed as climate engineering research, but there's little interaction between the different agencies. There's no real research money coming through the National Science Foundation and elsewhere. At the moment, if there is a geoengineering conversation in DC, it's behind closed doors, and it's not moving anywhere very quickly. The US government has its eyes firmly focused on the 2015 Paris climate meetings and doesn't want geoengineering to be seen as a distraction. But at the same time, in some of the meetings that we've been taking in Washington, D.C., it's very clear that people in the current administration in Washington, D.C. Recognize and are very concerned about the possibility of a pivot on the political right around climate engineering. So what does this mean? What this means, I think, is that this next decade is going to be incredibly important, not just for climate engineering research in the social sciences and physical sciences, but an engagement between our various communities of research and those who make policy in our different countries and internationally. I want to make just 2 points about this connection between research and policy engagement. Now, I've heard it said here in different forums that SRM in particular is an inherently ungovernable technological form. That's simply not true. It's simply not true if one understands governance as being about much more than formal regulatory regimes and about being much more than the ability to coerce and force people to take certain forms of action through, say, sanctions. It used to be that SRM research was firmly governed by a taboo against polite conversation around geoengineering research. I've heard lots of talk here. The point has been made a number of times that the 2006 paper by Paul Crutzen, the famous paper, broke the geoengineering taboo. The fact that we had a social contract within the scientific community that held us back from even polite engagement with the topic is a form of governance. Now, lots of people in the social scientific community, particularly those who would rather not, for whatever reason, see the political taboo that currently exists around geoengineering be broken, would prefer not to see any kind of open talk about geoengineering. And so we hear some people advance the position that any talk about, say, forms of regulation that would allow geoengineering research to take place are actually promoting geoengineering research because we're opening up space for that to be imagined as a possibility. And as soon as you do that, people will move into that space. So there's good reason to think that way, because I think that's an entirely reasonable perspective. But here's the thing. To use a metaphor that is overused, the climate geoengineering genie is not going to be forced back into its bottle. This is far too enticing and powerful a set of technological options. And we need to keep in mind those nightmare scenarios. If these technologies are gravitated to by, say, the American political right, then they'll be used again as ways to delay other forms of climate response. We don't have the luxury as research communities of disengaging from the policy conversation. In fact, in the next decade, what's going to happen is that we're going to be called on more and more, either because of climate emergency perceived emergency or objective real emergency. Or because there are political actors who see, for whatever reason, for whatever interests and ends, that climate geoengineering is a conversation that needs to be advanced, we will be called on for our expertise. And we need, as communities of people who are engaged with these questions, to come up with appropriate answers. We need to craft new narratives, as we've heard in many sessions. We need to continue to work on building new formal governance initiatives. We need to do the sorts of work that you've been talking about. We will do those forms of work in the spirit of the panel. And on the research side, we need to embrace, because I'm from the political sphere, we need to embrace what I've heard many people at the conference talk about, the need to stop talking just about governance and talk about governance in this very narrow term, but start talking about climate and geoengineering politics in a much broader sense. There is lots of politics without governance, as Olaf Corey has said. The second point, very quickly to wrap up. The second thing that's going to happen is that we're going to put to bed any lingering idea that geoengineering research and potential deployment is somehow apolitical. There's an undercurrent whenever you get a meeting between physical scientists and social scientists, as we come from our different disciplines, that we don't understand one another, and that the physical scientists just want the social scientists to get out of the way so that the physical scientists can do their work. Sometimes that's implicit. On a few occasions I've heard it stated explicitly. The implication seems to be that we need to somehow sidestep the politics. We need to get the politics out of the way and just let the researchers come up with the fixes that we need. It's not true. It's not possible. Because, as Langdon Winner and many other scholars have made clear for any number of years, technology and technological development is an inherently political process in two senses. The first sense is that there's always going to be a struggle over technological forms. In these sorts of forums, through the sort of town hall meeting that we had last night, through our different discussions and readings of one another's work, we're engaged in a form of political struggle over the future of these technological forms. As research monies get allocated, as research scientists and institutes start pushing technologies potentially out into the world, we will see political struggle over development and deployment. That will always take place. And in the future, we're going to have to, and we will, I posit, be more explicit about the inherently technological aspects of bringing these technologies out into the world. The second way in which technology is inherently political is that if and once these technologies exist, then they give rise to political effects. They must. If tomorrow a carbon dioxide removal scheme that was cheap and effective, was able to suck huge amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere, was suddenly put on the table, all of climate politics would change overnight. Every conversation about the world's energy system and the need for decarbonization would change overnight. Once technologies are out into the world, they have political effects. The same is true, and we can't deny this, we shouldn't deny it, the same is true of solar radiation management technologies. At the risk of I'm going to be a little blunter than I normally am, in the spirit of being provocative. From some of the physical scientists who work on climate engineering, I've heard some frankly disingenuous and perhaps naive statements about politics. Things like, we distrust the United Nations, and the reason that we're in this field is because of the feckless political response through the United Nations Framework Convention process. But if we deploy something like solar radiation management, there will magically be some sort of international agreement about how this can best be utilized. That's rubbish. It's just not true. We will get much more realistic about the way politics actually operates in the world. We have to, as a community of scholars on the social science side, study the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. And so the time now, in terms of the engagement between the research and policy communities, is for a robust conversation that diligently and carefully advances safeguards of appropriate kinds that privilege appropriate forms of technological development.
Lovely. Thank you. And last up we have Mark Lawrence, who I believe you know by now. He is still the scientific director of the Sustainable Interactions within the Atmosphere cluster at the IASS. Mark.
Still, I like that. Should that
Still.
imply something after this week?
So far as I know.
Which is still rescued, right? So Andy started off with a quote by Yogi Berra about predicting the future. How many of you actually know who Yogi Berra was? A handful, that's good. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. Well, what he was famous for. He was a great baseball player. Interestingly, in the break before this, I was trying to remember that quote and was talking with Simon, and he said, well, he doesn't know the quote by Yogi Berra, but he knows a quote by Niels Bohr, which was exactly that quote. So now we have a little bit of history to deal with, but that's for another time. We can deal with the history of who really came up with that quote in the first place. So I see my time is up and I'm 3.5 minutes over already. This is pretty impressive. All right, I didn't realize I've been talking that long. So for my opening statement, I'd like to make 3 points. You probably could have predicted that, right? But I'm going to keep them, exactly, those who know me at least. But I'm going to keep it very short, which you certainly couldn't have predicted if you knew me. So the first point that I'd like to make is that as I could have predicted it and as I did predict in the first place, almost everything that I would have predicted about the future of research in climate engineering has already been predicted by my colleagues here. So it doesn't leave me a lot to say, which is why I predicted that I would have a relatively short opening statement. The second point that I'd like to predict is that nothing that they have predicted is going to happen except for those things which actually are right predictions. Let that settle in for a moment. The difficult part of sorting out the predictions that are the predictions that aren't going to happen and the predictions that are going to happen is, of course, the real key to the matter. And I'm not going to try to tell you which of those will happen and which won't. I think this is going to be the crux of the discussion that Andy would like to bring around here as we predict, what did you say, throw away caution to the winds and predict as if there's no tomorrow.
Predict as if there's no tomorrow.
Except for the tomorrow that we predict. So, and the third point I'd like to make is a serious point, which is there is one thing that I can add to what the colleagues have predicted, which is that I would predict that the way in which we are going to go about researching the issues, the breadth of issues around climate engineering, will follow the call that was made yesterday at the town hall meeting to be highly self-reflexive and to make a study of the way that we go about studying and discussing climate engineering. And that will continue this type of self-reflection, which is beginning to build up. But I really predict that call will be taken, will be heeded, and the direction that we'll be heading is a greater degree of self-reflectiveness in the way that we're going about this topic. And I certainly think that that's something, you said we shouldn't talk about what's a should, but I would say that is something that I would welcome as a should for the future, and it's something that I would also predict as a will for the future. And I made it in 1 minute and 15 seconds.
Thank you, Mark.
You could not have predicted that.
So we'll come to the predictions from the rest of you in a moment. I wanted to just ask Hauke something. Hauke, you mentioned that you thought that models will continue to improve, and that seems a reasonable assumption if more money goes into them. But so what? What are we going to be able to do with models? What are we going to learn from models that we don't know now that will make a difference to policy making in the real world?
Well, I think one field where improvements are going to happen is the area of modeling, which we start calling actually predictions. That is the decadal scale. And I think that will be crucial because we had a detection and attribution study discussion earlier this conference, and I think in order to have trust in projections and the attribution of climate engineering measures, you would need to prove that you are able to predict on the time scale of, say, 10 years the climate anyhow. So that's maybe not in the next 10 years that we will see huge improvements, but I think that will be a process. Certainly that is something that is tackled at different institutions, and I think that's a necessary improvement for any implementation if that may ever be considered.
So, Victoria, in that case, what do you think? Models improve, the predictions get better. Is that going to be enough to convince a skeptical public and interest groups that grow up around geoengineering that this is something worth pursuing at any scale out of doors? Is the kind of information that Hauke's models might come up with useful in your sense?
Well, I think at least the people I've been talking to in my focus groups and other settings, they have also other types of concerns which are related to the trust in institutions, to ethics, to concerns about the relationship between humans and nature. So I think there are different types of concerns that will come up. I mean, the scientific part is one part, but then there are also other dimensions which I think are relevant to the broader public.
Those dimensions, presumably the politics, power relations, the ethics surrounding the issues. Simon, I wonder if you'd weigh in on that. One of the things that you brought up is the possibility of the climate emergency. This is something that's been going around various discussions this week. And the concern, which is obviously one I share, is a scenario we talked about this morning, that the prospect of a climate emergency and the use of a climate emergency could cause the flip of discussion on geoengineering, so the right wing starts to take control. What do you think we can do now to prevent that? And if we can't prevent that, why is that a bad thing?
Well, there's a whole sociology of emergencies. And sometimes emergencies can bring out the best in us individually and collectively, and sometimes they bring out our worst attributes. A colleague of mine, Mike Maniates, talks about Goldilocks emergencies. He says that within the environmental movement writ large, there's this embedded theory of social change. If we can just get an environmental emergency that isn't so big that it destroys civilization as we know it and isn't too small that it can be ignored, if we get an emergency that is just right, that will galvanize public opinion in the sorts of ways that will lead to the large-scale social response, which is the obvious way to tackle climate change. Right? We know how to tackle climate change. We know we need to leave most fossil fuel reserves in the ground. We need to find low consumption, high prosperity pathways for countries both rich and poor. We know what it's going to take. And so one can imagine an emergency which takes us in that direction, and then we can imagine that climate engineering will be talked about as a last resort, bottom of the bucket, final type of response if we just can't get there, even though we're doing in good faith all of the other things that we ought to do and in fact must do. Right? So that's one sort of emergency-driven pathway. But emergencies of all kinds can also bring out the worst in us. You see looting sometimes when the hurricane strikes. You see at the moment in the United States people taking to the streets and the National Guard being called out in ways that are destructive of social order and so forth. Within the sociology of emergencies literatures, it turns out that if you can build robust social ties and networks so that there is this level of trust between people that exists ahead of the emergency, you're much more likely to bring out the best in people after the emergency than before. And so one of the things that we need to do is work with publics, work with policymakers to make sure that we are trusting one another, not just around the sorts of information that we can convey, because politicians aren't going to take all of the work that we give them and treat it in the ways that we expect them to treat it, right? Let's not be naive in that sense as well. They will pick and choose and do what they want with it for political ends. But if we build up levels of trust as research communities, we may be able to have more sway on climate engineering moving forward in a productive rather than a destructive way.
Mark, is that going to be enough? Working with the publics, more self-awareness and self-study by the community. This is an enormously controversial issue that we're working on. Are those sorts of things you called for more self-reflection, self-awareness? Is that going to be enough to prevent this becoming polarized and allow us to make good, sensible decisions?
Probably not. It won't be enough, but it will help to keep it from becoming even more polarized and keep preventing us from making even less sensible decisions. I think it was put in one of the panel discussions, there are no good choices left. And we're going to be up against really, really hard decisions. And so even though there's likely to be a great deal of polarization around this issue because of the various cultural, religious, and political backgrounds that shape people's perception of what climate engineering is all about. And so it's going to, almost undoubtedly, that would be one of my predictions, be a highly polarized issue. But whether that polarization plays out in shouting matches or whether it plays out in violent conflicts can probably be influenced by the way in which we go about the research. And so I think that there, involving the public and involving key groups early on in the discussions, in the formation of our understanding and of our perceptions and our standpoints on climate engineering issues, the whole range of issues around that huge umbrella term, will make a difference in how it eventually plays out, even if it is still a highly controversial and heavily polarized issue 50 years from now.
Okay, super. It seems unfair that we're having all the predicting fun up on the stage, so it's your turn to join in. At this point, I'm going to pose one or two questions to folks in the audience. Now, I'm going to pose them to you, not you to me, for now. Can we have the house lights up, please? Because I'm going to ask you to put your hands up if you think it is very likely that solar geoengineering will be deployed within the next 50 years. So put your hands up.
Very likely.
Very likely. Right up, please, so we can see who's in the room. Right up. Okay, now keep your hands raised. Don't worry, I'm not going to pick on you. Keep your hands raised if you think it's likely to be deployed within the next 40 years. Some wavers at the back. 30 years? 20 years? 10 years? Bron, I think I saw you go last. You know that bit where I said I won't pick on you? Yeah, not all predictions come true, I'm afraid. So, Bron, you said you think it might be likely that solar geoengineering is deployed within the next 20 years. Can you give us some sort of scenarios that you think that were informing your belief that might happen? What sort of things might cause us to deploy within 20 years? Sorry.
Well, I think one of them is definitely the idea of a small, a sort of medium-sized unilateral coalition of countries. I mean, maybe I was a little slow bringing my hand. Maybe 30 years, is more reasonable. But I certainly think, if America and China start talking seriously about it, then that could really create a lot of momentum. And a possible climate emergency. I'm not saying anything radically new here, but both of those things, I think, could lead to deployment. But whether we're not talking about full deployment. I think it will be more sort of regional, starting regional scale ones rather than anything more massive, I think.
Okay. I also saw Andrew. Andrew, your hand sort of disappeared around the 25-year mark. It was wavering and it went. How do you see things going? Why do you think it's very likely we'll deploy in 25 years?
I think that there's little chance in the near term that we're going to do anything on abatement until solar becomes cheaper than coal. That'll be the tipping point, right? And if that doesn't happen before we start to see some really significant climate impacts, then I think we'll get relatively near-ish term deployment. And particularly, I think that the kind of fear of the unknown is going to fade, and people are going to just take the view that it's objectively less risky to mitigate against the effect of future emissions using solar radiation management than it is to continue to bear the risk of future emissions. What I don't think we'll see is, I think we'll see mitigation of tomorrow's emissions, but not yesterday's, because I think that there's always a kind of better the devil you know with the existing climate, but people will want to stop further changes.
Okay, panel, there you have it. Great powers, emergencies, a belief in mitigation, that mitigation's not working. Victoria, do you think that is the sort of thing that's going to persuade publics to deploy? If it's based on a belief that mitigation is not working, then I'd imagine it would need to be something fairly widespread. Do you see that being a motivating factor?
Well, I'm not sure. When we asked our focus group, we deliberately asked them about this climate emergency argument. And what we found was that while they were kind of trying it out, they came to the conclusion that, okay, this just makes mitigation even more important. And they kind of rejected that argument. But that was in an artificial setting in a focus group. If it happens for real, I don't know.
Yeah, so the pressure might go up in reality. Simon, the great powers, are they our suspects, they are chief suspects for deployment in the next 20 years?
Let me take the question you just asked first, if I may. I don't know if it's right to talk about publics having an essential say in how climate engineering technologies may be deployed, because the main decisions about research and deployment will be made in the traditional corridors of power. They'll be made in corporate boardrooms, they'll be made within, not these sorts of meetings, I had to break it to you, but within the halls of government. And of course, one of the things with climate engineering is that it's so easy to sell as a sacrifice-free form of response. We all know that it's not. We can say until we're blue in the face that it's not, but it's going to be really easy to package that way. I've often been called a misanthrope when it comes to human nature. I'm a little skeptical about the ability of people to come together in effective ways around these very complex social challenges. And so the vision I'm putting forward is of the misanthropocene, as my friend Kate O'Neill puts it. Because it's in our collective natures to hope for miracles in the face of big challenges, and it's in the collective natures of our politicians and our corporate leaders to promise them. And a public can very easily be led down pretty dark paths.
Okay, let's reverse that question. I wonder if so many people will put their hands up this time. Put your hands up if you think that it is very unlikely that humanity will ever deploy solar geoengineering. Very unlikely that they will ever deploy. And keep them up if you're prepared to explain why. Steve Rayner.
Strangely enough, given my position on the importance of research, I'm actually personally deeply skeptical that humanity will ever deploy sulfate aerosol injection, largely because I think that it would not be politically feasible to do so without a universal treaty agreeing to it. I am, I think, well known as somebody who is deeply skeptical of the need for universal treaties to do almost all of the sensible things that we might do to deal with climate change. But the one thing that I would think you would need to have a universal treaty for actually is sulfate aerosol injection, and we know how good we are at getting climate treaties, right? Why do I think it would not be done without such an agreement? I think that the international political implications, the international relations implications, the security implications of major powers going it alone would be a very strong disincentive to any major power to do that. I think the most likely scenario for any kind of sulfate aerosol injection activity actually, in my view, is that if a small island state were to do it as an act of global civil disobedience, in a way to actually put it out to the major powers, look, you've driven us into this corner, we're going to allow some aircraft to be used from our airfields in order to spray some of this in the stratosphere, now you stop us. And I think that that could be a very effective form of global civil disobedience. But other than that, I'm deeply skeptical that we will actually ever see this technology being used. However, I also believe that we should be trying to understand it a lot better than we understand it at the moment.
So deployment as a form of social disobedience. Panel. Civic disobedience. Panel. Hauke, you balked at that. Why?
Social disobedience is really not my... Civil disobedience is really not my topic. I have strong difficulties to answer to that, but I would like to reiterate another point that I made in the beginning. I think in addition to that, I mean, what you said earlier, that you see it unlikely that this will ever happen. I'm also fairly convinced that most of the suggestions that are made today, if we ever try to research them in more detail, we will probably figure out that they will work less well than people may think today. Hopefully that will refrain us from using them. I'm not 100% sure. But I think that's an additional point why I don't see it very likely that solar geoengineering will be applied.
I'll go along with that.
Mark?
So I'll go along with Hauke in... Is my mic on? Yeah, I'll go along with Hauke in saying that this is certainly not my specialty. So I'm being, like Steve said on the first day, I'm being undisciplined here in not classifying myself into a discipline and going out on a limb a little bit. But I would predict, the reason that I would add to that as a prediction of why there would perhaps be an unlikelihood, I'm sure if I would say very unlikely, but I'd say unlikely that solar radiation management techniques will be deployed is a two-part prediction. One, because we will succeed in communicating about this topic broadly to the larger societal components, especially then social leaders, and two, the religious perspectives, which govern the way a lot of people think about things, will have a dominant role in the way that people perceive climate engineering when it's communicated to the broader community. And what we have found so far is that there is very little known, only a few studies here and there, about religious perspectives on climate engineering. There's a lot known about religious perspectives on climate change. All of the religious leaders of the world have dealt with climate change. None of them have dealt with climate engineering yet. But what we found in a workshop and what we found in dialogues that we've had so far is that all of the religious traditions that we've discussed this with take a very, very skeptical standpoint to solar radiation management interventions with the Earth. And so my addition to Steve's prediction there would be that this will also be a force that would be preventative in a large-scale implementation in the future, in addition to the governance problems that you mentioned.
Do you think that religious positions might change depending on the severity of climate change and the success of mitigation efforts?
Now that's an interesting one. Will changes in the world change the way that people relate to their religious traditions?
Or people interpret the religious traditions? Yeah.
I think, I'm going way out on a limb also. We've got other experts in the audience who do this perhaps a little bit more academically, but you asked us to predict like there's no tomorrow, so I'll predict like I will still be director at the ISS tomorrow, even if I'm predicting outside of my area of expertise. And I would say that only slightly. I would say that certainly environmental change may push and shift the way that people relate to their religious traditions. What I think is much more likely to have an impact on the way people relate to their religious traditions is technological development and then our capacity to modify, instead of at the huge scale of Earth system, to modify at the very small scale of genetic code. And there may be shifts in our the religious perspectives, and I can't predict which way it's going to go, though. That could either go towards loosening up our traditional understanding of the various religious traditions, or it could go to solidifying them as a backlash to these kinds of developments and this kind of potential that we have through technology.
Much as I enjoy picking on you for questions, and I really do we have any self-generated questions from the audience you'd like to ask to the panel? White T-shirt over there was first to have hands up.
Thanks a lot, Andy. I'd like you to repeat the exercise, but with when the audience think that, if ever, we'll get to a situation where we have net negative emissions.
Audience, do you think we'll ever get to the situation where we have net negative emissions? Just straight hands up if you think we'll get to that situation. And should we do it time-wise as well, Tim? Yeah. Why not? Who thinks that we will get to net negative emissions within 100 years? Within 50 years? 20 years? So I guess most people are somewhere there between 20 and 50. Hugh, I do enjoy picking on people. I'm going to do it again. Hugh, what technologies do you think are most promising for getting us to net negative emissions of CO2 within the next 50 years?
Well, I think we've got a couple of generations of extremely clever young people who are going to be working towards these technologies. There are all sorts of interesting technologies that we can use now, which I think with economies of scale, they'll become far more available and far more believable and far more accessible than they are now. And I think that we can see now what's happening with solar energies and wind energies, and they're becoming much cheaper than we ever imagined they would become. But I think that the driver will be really increasing unacceptability of burning fossil fuels. And once we've got to the point where we just simply say it is unacceptable to burn fossil fuels, which I'm sure will happen soon, then the drivers will become just so strong, it'll happen very quickly.
Panel, what happens? How do things change Now, this is a question Tim actually once asked for me, but I think it's an interesting way of looking at it. How will things change the day that it becomes possible to remove carbon from the atmosphere for, say, $20 a ton? What happens that day?
Please.
Oh.
He was pointing to the ladies first. I guess was what Simon was saying.
Confusion, I think, is the answer.
Well, I don't know if there's an economist here on the panel. Probably not. So, but as far as I understand the economist's positions, I mean, that would be the game changer. So once it is that cheap to remove carbon from the atmosphere, it probably will be done.
But won't there be a limitation based on how much? I mean, if you can remove it, that's if it's only a delta and you can only get out a few gigatons of that, then it won't help much. So maybe we need to modify the question, not just $20 per ton, but $20 per ton for 500 gigatons.
Storage capacity. Tim, you were the one that asked me originally.
Safe, robust, and stable. So you can imagine no side effects, and it will be long-lasting. Sorry. No material side effects, long-lasting, and you can scale it to whatever extent you like.
How quick?
I'm putting forward a technological imaginary that at a point in time, you have a technology that can be that can remove as much as you're willing to pay. So at $20 a ton, you can remove as much as you like. You are only constrained by the amount of money that you want to spend at $20 a ton.
Panel, do we go careering into peak oil in that scenario?
Well, we're already on track. We're already being driven by large-scale social, economic, political forces to dig every available drop of oil out of the ground. That's the path that we're on. So we're careening towards peak oil right now.
I would say peak oil and peak methane.
Every ounce of coal, every unit of natural gas is going to come out of the ground if we continue on our present path. As Hugh pointed out to me on the first night, we all have a stake in the future of the oil and gas industry through, say, our pension funds. Our global wealth is based, to a large degree, on these resources being utilized. So that's our current pathway. This makes it more palatable, makes it more politically, but this is also the attractiveness of this technological mindset, isn't it? This idea that we can always imagine that just over the horizon, this sort of technology exists. And again, if we see the world as it is rather than we wish it to be, politicians utilize that sort of technological mindset to keep promising us that the solution is coming and to delay action over and over and over again. So,
to be fair to Tim, he didn't ask me that question in the context of a panel predicting the future. Right. It was an interesting thought experiment. Mm-hmm. Let's take another question. John, do you want to wait 1 sec for the microphone?
So I have a question about the future of the research in geoengineering. Simon, I would add a little bit to a comment that you made. I think there is a cohort of physical scientists that are really eager to have the engagement of social scientists to give them a framework for evaluating different kinds of research and understanding whether it's ethical or not. And I think one thing that worries me is the way for a big science experiment to fail is for a group of theorists to get together and say, this is what we should measure, and then pass that set of measurement ideas along to a group of engineers who come up with the solution. We've seen in climate observing when we try to do that projects don't succeed, they go way over cost, they don't increase scientific knowledge. So I think building on some of the suggestions that Hauke made about potential experiments that could be done to refine processes that are currently contributing a lot of uncertainty to how geoengineering technologies might work. Could we imagine a process where something like 5 experimental groups give 12 different ideas for small-scale experiments and pass those to a group of social scientists who evaluate those experiment designs from a social science perspective and give those results back to the scientists, and then the scientists can look at how the experimental designs could be changed and how that might change their sociological implications. I'm dismayed that without a process like that, science is going to go off in one direction and social science another, and it's going to be very slow making progress.
The relative role of natural and social sciences in experimentation. Whose game?
I think some in the room may be game.
I'm sorry?
I think some in the room may be game. Is this the point you wanted to speak to?
Germain, I was going to turn to you in a second. Are you keen to respond to this question now? Or? Are you keen to respond to John's question now? Or
no, it's a larger issue.
Okay, we'll take a second question. Think about what John asked. We're going to come.
I could say on John's question already, I think.
Have you got an answer already? Please.
This is, I mean, I might be taking a little bit away from it, but I think this is where experiments like GeoMIP need to be headed. I think this kind of iteration that you're talking about is what we really need to do as next steps in what has been so, I think, really tremendously well built up from the work, the initial work that Hauke and Ben and Alan and others who helped to develop GeoMIP in the first place put into it. And I think this is really the next step of where we need to go, is exactly that kind of iteration. But since we're not talking about will, or no, not talking about should, I guess we should talk about will, and I predict that this is where it is going, but probably only half as good as we would like it to be, because there's not a lot of practice with that. This community, although I agree with you about calling it a community, is difficult, and this field is difficult, but this, as Jason Blackstock and Steve Rayner on the first evening pointed out, this field of research seems to be one that is exemplary in terms of the amount of exchange in the very early stages between natural and social scientists, and also between academics and non-academics. And so I think it will happen, but it won't happen as well as we would like it to, because we don't have the mechanisms for making that happen.
I'm not sure that the particular arrangement you very quickly sketched is workable. I think that will be endlessly iterative. We'll be passing ideas backwards and forwards, and no research of any sort will ever get done. And I take seriously Ken Caldera's point that rather than think about geoengineering as a special class of technological forms that has to be set off on its own, we can learn from our experience with other scientific forms of investigation and other technological forms to find robust ways to make sure that there is a social license for the sorts of experiments that take place. But given the nature of this sort of meeting, there is an opportunity for experimentation, and so I would completely welcome and value the sorts of ideas that you're talking about, and seeing where they might lead.
Helena, I'm going to come to you in 1 second. In the interest of Steve's shoulder health, I'm going to invite him to speak very, very briefly. Have a minute on that last issue.
Very, very briefly, I would counsel great caution with respect to the idea that social scientists should or could be used as surrogates for the public. I don't think it is the role of the social scientist to advise scientists basically on how to market their particular ideas and experiments to the public. I think it may be, we may have a role to play in mediating the discussions between the scientific community and the public, but that's a different role. But I'd be very, very cautious about the idea of any of us stepping in to that role of trying to be a surrogate for the popular will.
I'll go to Helena. If you wait 1 second, it's coming down the side.
Thanks very much. I want to ask a question about CDR. And the question is to do with really the kind of broad scope and the kind of huge mixture of things that are involved in CDR, and whether the panel sees dangers in CDR in any way, the fact that it could, the kinds of impacts that it could have, the kind of scales people are talking at, because I think we can't just talk about SRM, and we have to talk about CDR. We've left it quite late to do that. And it's a complex issue with a lot of interactive factors. So could the panel address that, please?
Panel, CDR. Mark, I see you writing. Are you writing about CDR?
No. I'm writing down what Steve said. That was really nice. But now I'll say something on CDR, if you want.
Excellent. Good man.
Done. Unless Hauke wants to take over first. Go ahead.
Well, maybe a very similar remark that I already made concerning SRM. Also in CDR, as far as I'm much less an expert, but as far as I see the suggested methods, there seems to be none that provides huge potential. So besides potential side effects that you're mentioning, but I mean, coming back to my initial remark on experiments in ocean iron fertilization, I think certainly they have shown that things are much more complicated. I think we should take that in mind. Also not see, also not make the assumption there is the option of removing the excess carbon by CDR.
Mark?
Just a tiny addition to Hauke's point, none that seem to show real potential in the near future. And I think there may change, and there's some indications that we may change that in the further future, but absolutely would agree with those points about the near future.
Is CDR development not going to be the real source of moral hazard in geoengineering? It's very clear to everyone in this room that solar geoengineering is not going to treat the cause of climate change. CDR, at least in theory, can promise that. Is that something, as CDR is researched more and more, are we going to see the moral hazard coming from the promise that a carbon-sucking technology at $20 a tonne, say, is just around the corner? Victoria?
Well, I'm not sure. Well, after having studied the trends in the scientific literature, I'm not really sure that CDR and SRM are the categories that will be mainly used. I think we'll go in a direction where we talk more about specific technologies, because they differ so much. So.
Yeah, and I think that's quite right. We need to disaggregate, as we've been told over and over again through this meeting. Again, the point that I'm most concerned about is that we see a collection of very powerful technologies and a collection of very powerful hands. But one can imagine a set of, say, CDR technologies that are more broadly distributed and lead to different types of social engagement. And so, for instance, my friend Bob Olson in Washington, D.C., who's been working with the Woodrow Wilson Center, wrote a paper a couple of years ago on what he calls soft geoengineering. A set of remediative technologies, a set of small-scale regional technologies that could be deployed and then retracted without large-scale potential side effects. We can imagine communities coming together for biological remediation of a sort that would store or perhaps draw down carbon that could be democratic and democratically controlled rather than given over to more powerful forces.
Okay, we're running fairly low on time. Do we have a futurist in the house? Thank heavens we do. Jamais, were they right? That's what we want to ask you. or if not, who was closest? Can you give us a reflection from a futurist's perspective on the things you've heard?
Of course, I'd be happy to. There are three important things whenever you think about the future, capital T, capital F, that you need to keep in mind. And this is across the spectrum of issues. The first is that the future is multifaceted, that you can't just hold all variables constant and only change one thing. So when you look ahead, if you're talking about 50 years out, are we going to do X, Y, or Z? You have to remember, well, that's also in the context of what are the political arrangements, what does the global demographics look like, what kind of pandemics have we had to deal with, what does it look like in terms of manufacturing technologies, are we pulling carbon out of the atmosphere to create diamondoid nanomachines? There are all sorts of things that you will need to be considering alongside your core question. The second is that the future is boring. The future is banal. And I say that because think about the world that you live in today and how excited you are to be living in the future of 1950. We live in a boring age because every age is boring. You've seen every step along the way to get you to something. And even when something exciting happens, something frightening happens, it's very quickly normalized. It very quickly becomes boring again. And that will be true for 2050 and 2100 as well. The things that when we look ahead, 20 years, 40 years, whatever, we usually look from the perspective of today. You know, with the starry eye of, wow, that's amazing, that's frightening, that's, transcendent technology or a radical change in politics. But for the people who live in that future era, it's boring because they've seen it every day. They've seen every step of how you get there. There's very little that's surprising to them. So you have to remember that we can't just contextualize the future as being these really big, shiny, scary monsters. And lastly, how to put this? There's no one future. Whenever those of us who work in this field, try to engage with clients, with our colleagues, we really try to make a point of not using the phrase "the future," but instead talk about futures plural. Because any prediction you make about the future is going to be wrong. You know, predictions are almost always wrong, especially when you get really specific about them. The goal is to be wrong in a useful way. To have that error, to have that misapprehension of the future turn into a source of aha, a source of a surprising awareness that you never really had captured before, that hadn't occurred to you. You hadn't seen that perspective before. Because the goal of thinking ahead isn't to tell you exactly what will happen. It's to help you become sensitive to possibilities, to be able to spot those early indicators, those distant early warnings that transformation is underway, so that what you can think, you can prepare, and then you can act.
Fantastic. I'm going to bring us to a fairly early close. I'm going to ask the panel in 1 second to give us one really positive prediction about the future. Give us something good that we can leave the room with a smile on our faces about. But before, I'm going to bring the mood down slightly by asking you one more thing. So put your hands up if you think that without deploying any form of CDR or any form of SRM, that humanity will manage to avoid, in all most likely probability, a rise of 2 degrees Celsius. So without using geoengineering, who thinks we will avoid it? We have 4, 5 in the room. I'm not going to pick on you this time for lack of time, but there are some optimists out there. To the panel then, starting from the far end, can you give us something to leave this conference happy about?
Oh, that's hard for me, Andy.
It doesn't have to be about, in that case, it doesn't have to be about geoengineering.
Yeah. No. So I'll quote David Orr, who said, if you consider the environmental situation and you're optimistic, you don't know enough. We live in dark times, but at the same time, he cautions against our being too pessimistic. So we need to find hope. And one can find hope from the geoengineering conversation, but not the sort of false hope that comes from pointing to big shiny technologies that might somehow save us. It comes from the hard work every day of making sure that if we move in this direction, we do so in appropriate ways. I think hope comes from the hard work that we all need to do.
Very good. Hauke?
In an earlier discussion today, I also made the point that it's important to communicate also where we had successes in the politics and environmental research interface. I mean, like the ozone hole, which I think is a huge success story that it seems to fill up again. Of course, the problem at hand is much, much larger. But still, I think we should not be desperate. There are examples where people have succeeded. My positive prediction for the future, say, next 10 to 15 years, is that the German Energiewende will not fail, and that hopefully that can set kind of an example. Yeah, let me stick to this hope.
So you said you're going to ask us in 1 second to give our happy predictions for the future. Does it mean I only have 1 second to say it?
Yes.
Good. No, I'll pick up on what Jamé said about there's not the future. There's not a future. There are many different futures, and I will at least put our vision towards one of the futures, which may be at the very tail end of the probability spectrum of possible futures, but at least that I see around me a tendency for people to finally get it out of their heads and a little bit into their lives to understand that less can be more, that even though everybody in this room knows money doesn't buy you happiness, most of the people in our world behave as though they didn't know that. And that we'll get that out of our behavior and start to realize that consumption is not the only way to have a satisfying life, and that we will eventually obviate the need for all of the discussion around, or the perceived need, whatever need it is, for all the discussion around climate engineering, because we will have actually made the transition to a truly bright and beautiful society. And even if that's way at the far end of the spectrum of futures, I would like to keep that as a possibility in our minds.
Thank you, Mark. Victoria.
Okay, it's hard to be the last one here. I think I'll just stay within the research. And I think it's a very positive signal that we are actually discussing, I mean, all these social ethical aspects at the very early stage. And I think this type of conference is one signal of us taking this seriously. And that's kind of inspiring and hopeful.
Good stuff. Well, thank you. Once you have thanked the panel for their bold predictions, don't leave the room. Mark is going to give a final brief address. But please thank them for being wrong in a useful way, your panel.
Who's the here, Andy?
Let's stick here.
Okay, so thank you, Andy, so much for guiding that very enlightening discussion, and thank you all for your contributions, the panel members and to the audience, to that very interesting discussion, which brings us to the end of our regular program here at the Scandic. As you all hopefully know, that this will be followed by the closing panel public event and the reception, which is for the conference participants, which will be taking place at the House of World Cultures, which is over towards the main train station and the what we call the Regierungsviertel, the government quarter of the town. There's 3 points I'd like to make before we release you all to head your merry ways and find your way over to there. The first one is that I'd like to say that I've been really pleased to see the many critical, sometimes quite intense discussions that we have had this week. These discussions have encompassed a wide range of topics, from climate modeling to governance and regulation, to framing and public perception, to ethical considerations, to art. And they've been carried out in a very wide variety of formats, from presentations to posters to panel discussions to educational and thought-provoking games, for those that were there for the To Gabon or Not Gabon game, to town hall meetings, and of course, especially in the informal discussions that I have heard and seen and taken part in between the sessions. So these discussions were on the many facets of the subject matter, but also they were at the meta level, being critically self-reflective, and about how we go about organizing and acting on the discussions. We witnessed a really classical example of this with the town hall meeting that was semi-spontaneously organized for Wednesday. And that point exactly was brought out with the call by Pablo Suarez from the Red Cross and Red Crescent to study ourselves as we go about studying and discussing the controversial and complex issues around climate engineering. The second point I'd like to make is some boring logistics, but they're important, so you know what you're up to next. First off, as I mentioned, the closing session will be at the House of World Cultures. It starts at 6:30 p.m. There will be a bus departing from in front of the hotel at 5:30 p.m. for those of you who are either lazy or who have lots of luggage. For those of you who would like some movement and some exercise, a number of our IASS colleagues are going to walk over to the House of World Cultures, and on the way over there you pass a number of historical areas in Berlin. I'm not sure exactly which path they're going to take, but some of the possible places they could go by are the Brandenburger Tor, the Holocaust Monument, the Parliament Building, and the Chancellor's Office. So if you would like to take a walk over there with them and see some of these historical areas, and it's not a very long walk, I'd say 20 minutes. Anybody disagree with that? Yeah. Say 20, 25 minutes from here, depending on how often you stop and what you want to see. Then please meet at 5:30 also, so the walking group will leave at the same time as the bus leaves, at 5:30 downstairs. When you go out the front doors, go to the right a little bit, and there'll be some flagpoles, and the group will meet there at the flagpoles to go over together. Of course, you're also welcome to go other ways. The helicopter service, unfortunately, is not affordable, and it uses too much. You're saying solar balloons. I'm not sure if we have. Well, I think actually we can fly over in the cloud machine, right? So yeah, those would be very good ways to get over there. Do you have it blown up? How many people can you take on board? Okay, so those are your two main options for getting over there. If you know your way around, you're welcome to try another way to get over there. Very important. Everybody listen. Really important. Bring your name badge with you. If you wish to participate in the reception afterwards. If you have already lost or discarded your name tag, then shinny yourself over to the office real quickly afterwards, after this is over, and try to figure out a way to get a replacement for it. Otherwise, please bring yours with you, because the reception will not be open for the public. The panel discussion is a public event, and we're hoping to draw a good bit of public. The House of World Cultures is very good at bringing in public for events like this, so we hope to have quite a large participation. But the reception itself is not open for the public, and so you'll need your name badge to get in there. So please bring it with you. Also, because the reception is only for the participants here, I'm not going to mention it anymore at the House of World Cultures. You just simply know, once you go out, you'll see where it's set up, or the signs to it, or just follow everybody else that's got a badge on, and head over to where the reception is afterwards. And then finally, on the logistical side, evaluation forms. We really appreciate you filling out the evaluation forms. You've got a good half hour to do it, or even more, before the bus and stuff like that leaves. So we really appreciate you filling out the evaluation forms. They can be found at the exit of this room, and I actually don't know where to turn them in. Can somebody fill me in on where we turn them in? Susanna, do you know where to turn them into? Where should they submit the evaluation forms? There's boxes there. Okay, very good. You see, I haven't filled mine on out yet. So put them in the boxes out there, if you would, please. Finally, I'd like to say some thanks. Andy already said thanks to the hotel and the surroundings here. I'd like to say thanks to quite a number of people, but I'm not going to mention any names, because then we would be standing here for way too long and you'd be late for your buses. So just in groups, I'd like to thank the steering committee, who were very instrumental in putting this entire program together. They had several meetings together and many more Skype meetings for making this happen, and I think they've done a fabulous job. And they were supported by an advisory group who gave input on a number of issues as it went along, including on things like evaluating the sessions and so on. So certainly a big thanks to the steering committee and to the advisory group for their role in getting this together. I'd also like to add to the thanks to the Scandic staff, a thanks to the IASS team of local organizers. There have been many, you've probably gotten to know a number of them by face and some by name, and they have been really, really helpful and had everything running smoothly. And from my personal side and on behalf of everybody that I've heard from so far, a big thanks to all of you who really were on the front lines, on the ground, and really helped to make this happen. I'd like to say a thanks to the conveners of the sessions. That's where a lot of the action really happened, and they put some real effort into thinking through these sessions and designing them, and to the contributors to the sessions, and also to all of those that you participate in all of you that participated in the exciting discussions in the many sessions. And I think we can also give a hand to the conveners and all. And that probably covers everybody that's in this room, but there's one more thanks that I want to give, which is to our funding agencies who have helped to make this possible, and who were very supportive in helping us to allocate the funding to actually putting together a first conference like that, and also to the institutes and the programs that have endorsed this and have supported it and have helped to drum up interest within their communities, and to end up bringing together this wide diversity of people for these global critical discussions of the CEC14. So with that, I wish you all well. I thank you all very much for your many roles in making this a successful event, and I hope that you'll be able to take out a lot from this into your future work on and around the topic, continue developing the networks that have begun developing, and wish you a nice way over to the House of World Cultures, and certainly a nice time at the event at the House of World Cultures tonight.